Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to COVID-19 in Asia, China, Japan, Indonesia, and Malaysia in focus. My name is Helen Lansdowne. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event this evening. Before we start, in keeping with the University of Victoria in real time, on real land, we would like to acknowledge with respect the Lokwangan speaking peoples on whose land the university is situated, unceded territory, that the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Wasanic peoples have a historical and continuing relationship with today. And we like to open our events acknowledging that and reminding ourselves that we are visitors to the land. This is a very exciting evening for our center. We have this book event, which it's exciting because it's being organized in collaboration with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Asian and Pacific Law at the University of Sydney. So not CAPI, but CAP+. As well as the Australian Network for Japanese Law. And some of our friends in Sydney, I personally haven't seen for many years, so it's terrific to bring us all together. That is one of the exciting effects of COVID in that it has forced us to use Zoom, and we're now able to cross continents and oceans and come together. Tonight, the presentations that you will hear are based on chapters from the new volume titled COVID-19 in Asia, Law and Policy Context. And here's my book, my copy. This book has been edited by our CAPI director and law chair, Victor Ramraj, who's also a law professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria. This was a monumental undertaking. The book came together through an international effort involving 61 scholars from across the globe amidst the height of the pandemic's first wave. So this was really at the very beginning, this project got started, and with the aim to examine and document the policy dynamics playing out across the Asia-Pacific region. It's published by Oxford University Press, and it came out in record time. It was published in December 2020. So it was the first book to be published on law and policy dimensions of the pandemic regarding Asia. So we are extremely proud of this undertaking. Tonight, you're lucky because you get to hear from 4 of the authors. They will each give a 10-minute presentation. Each of their presentations will be followed by commentary from an assigned discussant. And after the presentations and commentary, we will then open up for Q&A. And should you wish to ask questions, please indicate at the time of the Q&A by just raising the hand icon in your window, and we will be back to a gallery view at that point, and we can have hopefully some terrific, fruitful discussion. Now, I want to introduce everybody right away because time is of the essence. So opening tonight, I have my dear friend and colleague, Feng, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Victoria. Her discussant comes from Sydney, Jeanne Huang, who is an associate professor of law and the deputy director of CAPI+. So they are going to start us off with the China chapter. That is going to be followed by chapter 21, Indonesia, Indonesia's response to the pandemic. Too little, too late, question mark. And that involves Nadirsyah, who comes from us, senior lecturer with the Faculty of Law at Monash University in Australia. We welcome. The discussant is Simon Butt, professor of law and the director of the Center for Asian and Pacific Law, and of course, from the University of Sydney, so from CAPI+. Our third presenter is Amzil Tayeb from the School of Social Sciences at the Universiti Sains, Malaysia. Amzil co-wrote the chapter 22, Malaysia, Improvised Pandemic Policies and Democratic Regression. And Amzil's discussant is Luke Nottage, Professor of Law at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Australian Network for Japanese Law. Our fourth speaker is the co-author of Chapter 10, Japan Keeping the Death Toll to a Minimum, Sigi Matsui, Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies with the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia, our friends across the water. So there you have it. There are the people involved in the program. But before I turn it over to Feng, I want to start by inviting Victor to answer a question that I have for him to sort of set the stage, if you like, because we are really celebrating this book tonight. So Victor, I want to turn to you and I want you to give us an insight, just one insight as to what prompted you to embark on this really monumental project.
Oh, gee, I wasn't even prepared for that, Helen. So let me delay by first thanking you for moderating. And also doing a little shout out and thanks to you for your excellent chapter, which we won't be discussing today, but we will at some other session, co-written with Jamie Lawson, the Just-in-Time Pandemic. It's a superb chapter, which looks at the impact of the pandemic on Southeast Asian workers across global production chains. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, those in the audience, please, I would encourage you to do so. And before I answer your question, Helen, more by way of delay perhaps, let me also say how much I'm delighted that we're collaborating with CAPI as well. And thanks to Simon and Jeanne and Luke for this opportunity. So in answer to your question, finally, well, what prompted it? I think I was just really bored once the lockdown happened and I had to find something to do. And it was a bit of a sanity ensuring measure, reaching out to everyone and trying to do something, because I think we all felt pretty helpless in those days, that the sort of world was happening, the pandemic was happening, and we were stuck and not able to do much. And as I reached out to the 61 contributors, I think there's a sense that we all wanted to do something. And I think that's why it was remarkable that really in a matter of 3 months, it went from idea to submitted manuscript, and OUP was great in bringing it out. So I think it was really that feeling that we needed to do something. And frankly, without all of the authors, the contributors, including those here today, if they hadn't sort of really stepped up, this never would have happened. So I am grateful. This is an editor's dream team, I would say, and it's great to have 4 of the contributors here. Helen, I don't know if I have time for 2 points, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the challenge of that process, right? We were dealing with a moving target, and the sort of strategy for dealing with this moving target was twofold. First, it was, I think we decided that we were going to try to capture the moment, the initial stage of responses, and really sort of freeze that in history. I like the journalist's phrase, a first draft of history, and I think in some ways that's what we were trying to do. But the other part of what we were trying to do was to identify some of the enduring themes that we suspected might come out of the pandemic, the themes that would outlive the early stages of the pandemic. And I'll be curious to hear whether the contributors think that we were able to do that. The other point I wanted to make was that what's really interesting about the volume, and I think this certainly comes out in the chapters we'll be hearing about today, is the sheer diversity of responses across the region. And as we look back now, a year and a half later at those early responses, I think we have a chance to consider whether the early response of each of these jurisdictions created a kind of a path dependency that has been difficult to escape. So I'll be curious to hear what the contributors think about that, and whether the governments were locked into their early responses, or if they were able to maybe learn from mistakes and self-correct as necessary. So those are just some preliminary thoughts, and I don't want to take up much more time. So Helen, let me hand it back over to you with thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. And I would just like to add, as I was reading, preparing for this event and reading the chapters for tonight, I realized that this would make a terrific textbook, because it is about the beginning and there is so much more to discuss. And I just kept thinking, wow, what a great teaching tool this book will make for, I'm sure, many classes. So on that note, I would like to invite Feng to speak to chapter 2 of the book, China Community Policing, High-Tech Surveillance and the Authoritarian Durability. So over to you, Feng.
Thank you, Helen. Liu Qian and I wrote this chapter last April and May, so it's been over a year ago. So I want to start my presentation with a brief update with some of my theoretical reflection on the relationship between coercion and consent. And on this relationship between coercion and consent, I draw insights from Antonio Gramsci. That is that consent and coercion have to be considered relationally. They are not, they are not separate. So when we look at, China's response to combat COVID-19, China successfully stopped the spread of COVID-19 through strict lockdown, quarantine, and you can say China won, to use Xi Jinping's words, won people's war, total war blockade against COVID. So we can say this is we're really looking at the coercive side of the state, right? Coercion and consent. But if we understand coercion state relationally, then you need to have a society that is conditioned to accept this kind of strict lockdown. Without that consent, this kind of measure simply will not be possible. So when we think about would it be possible in Canada or United States? No. So fast forward. So if we look at the current campaign China is undergoing since April, is about to get people to agree to consent to be vaccinated, right? So in theory, in principle, individual in China has to be consented to get vaccination. But also we're not just looking at securing consent from individuals, but we are also talking about, a whole technical capacity to make vaccines and administer vaccines. Based on my quick look at internet, there's been tremendous effort on the part of the government at all levels in China to ramp up the rate of vaccination, because they've been really very slow in getting going, because this is the problem of having too successfully stopped the spread of virus. But in principle, as I said, individuals have to be consented to get the vaccination, but there's been tremendous pressure to get people vaccinated. It's even, so we start to see the kind of the mobilization of bureaucratic machine down from top down to grassroots, 社区, to get people to vaccinate by calling them, offering free vehicles, and to even just outright coercion, like if the company does not meet the target of say 70% of their employees get vaccinated, you might, get your license, you might lose your business license. So we're talking about, there is so we have to look at consent coercion relationally. I mean, I have more to say on this, but in the interest of time, I have to now start my presentation on the chapter. So I focus my presentation on China's legal and social prevention control mechanisms, most notably community policing and surveillance technology. China's SARS experience in 2003 and the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008 stimulated a well-developed regulatory system and governance infrastructure to address the outbreak of COVID-19. Beyond the state's disaster response capacity, wartime mass mobilization down to the long-standing Shequ community policing role of, together with recently developed high-tech surveillance technology, are crucial to China's success. China's emergency responses reflected a mixture of mass mobilization of political, economic, social resources, as in war times, post-war modernizing efforts at legal, regulatory, and institutional governance, and Foucauldian modes of neoliberal governance, steering individual citizens to exercise self-surveillance and self-care. Now, after SARS, China introduced legal instruments on public health emergency preparedness that had been missing. Regulations on dealing with the outbreak of public health emergencies and the measures on the prevention, treatment, and management of SARS were developed during the SARS outbreak, covering information reporting, treatment, and prevention. In 2004, the National People's Congress, the parliament, drastically revised the 1989 law on the control of infectious diseases. In 2007, China passed the emergency response law. Of these, only the law on the prevention and treatment of infectious diseases has a privacy stipulation. Several institutions were also set up post-SARS to centralize disaster management and improve coordination. A spokesperson system covering all government departments and levels ensures centralized control of public information dissemination while projecting an image of open and transparent government. The State Council also set up a permanent disaster management task force, the State Council Emergency Management Office, with its own personnel and budget. The Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, was set up in 2018, and CDC at subnational levels were also set up. However, CDC is just an administrative unit under the National Health Commission. That status does subject the CDC to administrative interference, so it lacks institutional independence in the public health emergency. So in addition to this kind of a post-SARS, especially legal, regulatory, and institutional buildup, what we see, what we saw, during the China's emergency response to combat COVID, is the Maoist style of mass mobilization. Mass mobilization, in fact, dominated the emergency response of the party, which took control of all decision-making with Xi Jinping as the commander, leading a Chinese People's War to block COVID-19 spread. Community policing, supported by social organizations and foundations, was one of the front lines, the other being hospital, as Xi Jinping put it. In the combat, in the People's War against COVID, there were two battlegrounds. One was obviously hospital, the other was community policing. So what we see is this paradox between the institutionalization and the party-state decision-making control in a crisis. So this kind of a paradox, is also something that Chinese scholars, legal scholars, have been writing about. how do you, maintain kind of this kind of legality in the time of crisis. So the People's War metaphor was used. The enemy was the virus. The friend was the Chinese people who rally around the CCP to win the battle. Facing this strategy against COVID-19, some local officials overcomplied and they were zealous. And this was actually condemned by some commentators as kind of lazy governance. And it was actually a sign of weak governance capacity. Some local officials, or personally or ordering or turning a blind eye to the actions of subordinates that technically really violated the laws. Some blocked roads to villages, some disclosed personal information of potentially infected persons. Most egregiously, some measures discriminated against residents of heavily infected areas. Some residential communities or forbade as non-locals from returning or banned tenants from entering their apartments. So, you have, so what we need to understand, we talk about China's COVID responses, but we also have to understand fragmented local implementations, local responses, right? And a lot of local officials down to village level, they were just overzealous, right? And just sort of discriminatory, practices which really violated the laws. Urban Residents Committee, now I'm talking about the community policing. Urban Residents Committee were created in 1954 to ensure local neighborhood monitoring for CCP control over the cities. In recent decades, as work units reduced their surveillance infrastructure, Urban Residents Committees renamed as 社区 communities assumed a greater surveillance tool. One of the most prominent policy areas that 社区 exercised surveillance over was the one-child policy. In 2003, the neighborhood policing system was rapidly converted to SARS detection. Against COVID-19, authorities considered 社区 a crucial firewall. Xi Jinping emphasized their key role as a battlefield, which I was just talking about, of great importance in the People's War, echoing language used against SARS. So under the 社区 great management system, a 社区 comprises several blocks, each monitored by a person designated to submit information and identify issues on housing and facilities, social organizations, sanitation, and so on. The success of 社区 pandemic governance sacrificed frontline community workers and volunteers. Several died of the extreme workload and responsibilities with limited resources. Community tracing through great management has been greatly enabled this time by big data and cloud technology in collecting, integrating, and controlling much personal information and in discovering contact networks. Lockdowns, quarantines, and economic shutdowns were effective in stopping the spread of the virus, but they also interrupted the flow of the just-in-time global supply chain production. In discussing global supply chain logistics, Deborah Cowan points to, quote, the biological imperative to flow, by which she means that the JIT supply chain system, by analogy to circulation system in biology, must keep material flowing in a wider system for that system to work. But by that same analogy, interruption of the flow becomes a threat to the wider system. However, a major policy puzzle has emerged that of how to allow people's mobility for daily life and work, including returning to work while allowing the authorities to monitor the population to contain the spread of virus. How can the authorities restart the economy in relative safety after the national economic lockdown? Technology provides a partial solution. So now everybody knows that apps using WeChat in China were downloaded on individual cell phones with color-coded quick response codes indicating degrees of risk to the wider population. So color-coded QR thus differentiated population by infection exposure and provided dynamic population management as people traveled locally or further afield. In addition, using this integrated e-governance, using its integrated e-governance platform on the 3 big telecom companies, the central government introduced its information big data travel card to monitor accurately every individual's travel history over the previous 14 days. So China's authoritarian regime, with its immense capacity, is arguably effective and efficient in responding to public health crises and minimizing fatalities. Surveillance technology for contact tracing enabled the movement while limiting infection. But such high-tech systems obviously raise privacy concerns. So the big brother is still the dominant Western image of authoritarian regimes. But what we argue in the chapter is that, the tension between users' concerns for privacy and the use of platforms such as WeChat, Sina Weibo, Alipay, and Sesame Credit cannot be easily resolved in what's considered surveillance, in the era of surveillance capitalism. Chinese citizens are increasingly datafied while socializing, shopping, getting loans, and traveling during the pandemic. The question then becomes why people voluntarily participate and willingly sign the health QR code and information big data travel card. Their functionality is based on voluntary participation. So if we visit, the steps an individual has to take to receive a green travel card, we see the individual becomes in that process what Michel Foucault calls a subject. That is, through the process, one becomes both an independent agent able to act and care for one's own health and welfare, and an individual subject to discourse of self-surveillance and self-care and to the logic of surveillance capitalism and an authoritarian will to know and control. And of course, yes?
You're gonna have to wrap it up.
Okay, so, what I want to say is that, of course, surveillance technology existed long before today's information technology. Foucault links the state's discovery of population during the 18th century as an object of scientific investigation and the state's desire to know its population's birth rates, death rates, and the changes in population in order to govern. So what's new is that, authoritarianism in China's responses to COVID, authoritarianism meeting surveillance capitalism, and the risks becoming normalized after the pandemic passes into history. But in the chapter, we also talk about China faced numerous challenges to its governance and state capacities in resuming its economy, getting people employed, and ensuring people's livelihood in the international context where the US-China relationship is fraught with tension. And the most immediate challenge, as I said at the beginning for a brief update, is to get, at least, over 70% of population vaccinated. And so this is a big challenge. So the Chinese government has elevated of Chinese people getting vaccination, not as individual obligation, but as about, determining the fate of China. So I'll end here.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeanne Huang is going to be the discussant for this presentation. Jeanne?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. And also thank you, Feng. I really enjoy reading your chapter and also hearing your presentation. I have very brief comments from 3 aspects. So the first one, I fully agree with you regarding the tension between the coercion and consent. Especially what's the meaning of the consent? Is it a genuine consent or is just a coerced consent? So China actually becomes the only great, large country who was the center of a pandemic, but now it become the first country prosper from the pandemic. So which bring the question regarding the legal and political system. So the question is that a non-democratic and centralized administration can better control pandemic than a democratic state? One example actually Feng mentioned is about personal information, the surveillance information, and the surveillance technology. From the legal aspects, during the pandemic, China published the first civil code, which also is the first time provide a chapter, a very short chapter on the difference between privacy and personal information protection. So in China, there is no right to personal information. The personal information is a civil interest rather than a right. So you have your right to privacy, but the privacy is supposed to very narrowly defined. And the personal interest means that only when your personal information has been illegally used, you have a legal standing to ask for remedy, for example, because it is not your right. So actually from the most fundamental civil code, you can see it provide a justification for China, the government to use or to some extent legally maybe abuse, legally use to a mass scope of personal information. However, the benefit actually is, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, before the vaccine was introduced, the government and the health administration, they need data. They need the personal data in these aspects to help control the pandemic. So the issue is the tension, and how the law should regulate or coordinate or harmonize the tension between the coercion and consent. And the second is about my specialized field is international litigation. So in United States, there are several litigations were initiated by individuals or civil rights group against China government, and also several entities in China, for example, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There are two big issues for this type of litigation. One is jurisdiction, because China claims absolute sovereign immunity. Therefore, there are already a few US courts decide that the court has no jurisdiction because of sovereign immunity. And the second issue at this stage is, even the court has jurisdiction, you need to conduct a service or process, right? And here they must resort to the Hague Service Convention, and Chinese central authority under the Hague Service Convention will not execute the request for service or process. So essentially, there will be a legal barrier, right, for the litigation. And the third brief comment is regarding Australia. Especially, Australia is very active to push China to, and also WHO to release what's the origin, or investigate the origin of the pandemic. I think everybody here has witnessed in the past 1 year, Australia has a lot of trade dispute with China. So here is an example of China's response to outside criticism. And China criticized the US as the hegemonism in terms of trade dispute, etc. But actually, between China and Australia, we see China actually follow the US's example. Yeah, so for all kinds of trade issues with Australia. Okay, so I just stop here. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Jeanne, very much. You've raised a lot to think about. Now we're going to turn to Indonesia, and Nadirsyah is going to speak to Chapter 21, Indonesia's response to the pandemic, Too Little, Too Late.
Okay, I only prepare for one slide, but I can share screen here. But that's okay. So I didn't get the access to share screen. So just read my papers then. So in October 2019, after winning the April presidential election, Indonesian President Joko Widodo, known as Jokowi, appointed the cabinet for his second term. Programs to implement his campaign promises, as well as a plan to move the capital city from Jakarta to a new area in East Kalimantan, had been publicly announced. So the atmosphere was good at that time, and there was a sense of hope and positive feeling across the nation. Little did he know that 2 months later, a coronavirus would be identified. The virus ruined dramatically the Jokowi administration plan and program. So my chapter with my colleague Nadirsyah Hamado seeks to evaluate the Jokowi government's response and explain why it has not been capable of responding quickly to COVID-19.
Nadir, if you are a co-host now, so if you want to bring up your slides, please feel free to do so.
Sure. So, okay. Okay. So our argument is as follows. The Jokowi administration could have done much more to anticipate the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. It could have taken the issue seriously in January, rather than waiting for 2 months to react. But other factors contributed to the insufficiency of the government response. So we discover 4 main barriers here. Political rivalry between the central government and the governor of Jakarta, and long disputes between the Indonesian Medical Association, Ikatan Dokter Indonesia, or IDI, and the health minister, together with inadequate coordination, unclear policies, and conflicting statements from Jokowi administration. And finally, the reactions of strict believers who insisted on ignoring the government's regulation on praying at home have all led to disaster. Jokowi's response was too little and too late, a hard lesson for his early second term as a president. Let me give you an overview of Indonesia's law and policy on this pandemic. The government had been in denial. That was the initial response from the Jokowi administration, despite its neighbors reporting many confirmed cases of COVID-19 last year. The first case in Southeast Asia was in Singapore, confirmed on 23rd of January last year. Malaysia confirmed 2 days after that. However, until early March 2020, the Indonesian government claimed that there were no cases of infection from COVID-19 in the country. The first confirmed case was reported on the 2nd of March 2020, when a dance instructor and her mother were reported to have been infected by a Japanese national. By 9th of April, the pandemic had spread to all 34 provinces in the country. So what happened between late January and early March? Why was there no case of COVID-19 in Indonesia during that period? In February, Indonesia's health minister attributed the country's absence of coronavirus cases to prayer. A study by Harvard University public health researchers in the first week of February last year found that Indonesia should have reported a coronavirus outbreak and could have undetected cases, given its extensive air links to China and the city of Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak. The then health minister dismissed this study as insulting. In February, unlike its neighbors, which were imposing tough travel restrictions, President Jokowi instead offered discounts of up to 30% to entice tourists to visit Indonesia last year. So between January and March 2020, flights from countries with high infection rates, including China, South Korea, and Thailand, continued to operate. And Jokowi's government was also reported to have allocated millions of dollars to pay social media influencers for tourism promotions. It seemed that his administration approached COVID-19 as an opportunity to boost trade, investment, and tourism. By declaring Indonesia a place safe from COVID-19, the Jokowi administration last year hoped that people would invest and visit. It looked smart, but proved in the end to be a dangerous game. The main problem with this approach was that President Jokowi could not foresee that COVID-19 was not a regional issue, but a pandemic that would change the world. The failure of his administration to anticipate the trajectory of the outbreak led to its slow response. In fact, the government gave the impression to the public that COVID-19 was a small matter. The health minister described the coronavirus as a self-limited disease from which sufferers could recover on their own by increasing their immunity. Even after the first case of the virus was confirmed, the administration continued to downplay its seriousness. The Home Affairs Minister urged the public to eat more bean sprouts and broccoli. The coordinating minister for Maritime Affairs and Investment insisted that the virus could not survive in tropical climates. And President Jokowi sang the praises of jamu, a traditional herbal remedy to boost the immune system against COVID-19. These comments implied that the response was an individual matter, not a public health issue requiring careful planning and coordinated governmental response. On 2nd March 2020, Indonesia finally declared that COVID-19 had reached the archipelago. This meant that the official response and reaction came 2 months late compared to its neighbors. President Jokowi admitted that he had been deliberately holding back information on COVID-19 cases to prevent the public from panicking. The media reported the president's statement, and I read here, "Indeed, we did not deliver certain information to the public because we did not want to stir up panic. We have worked hard to overcome this since the coronavirus outbreak can happen regardless of the country's borders." After the first case was confirmed, the government took nearly a month finally to begin to act, banning mass gatherings through what they call it PSBB, pembatasan sosial berskala besar, or large-scale social restrictions. This is Indonesian version of lockdown. It also announced the release of 30,000 prisoners from the country's overcrowded and unhealthy prisons. The Jokowi administration also issued a government regulation in lieu of law, Peraturan Pemerintah Pengganti Undang-Undang, known as Perpu, which boosted state spending to 405.1 trillion Indonesian rupiah. It's like 24.6 billion US dollar. As a result, the budget deficit was anticipated to widen to 5.7% of GDP. Under the emergency power stipulated in Article 22 of the 1945 Constitution, the government may issue a Perpu, but this measure needs to be approved by Parliament during its tax sessions. Accordingly, the Perpu was intended to serve as a foundation for the government, including the banking and financial authorities, to carry out extraordinary measures to ensure the people's health and to safeguard the national economy and the stability of the financial system. The program and budget proposed in October 2019, when Jokowi appointed his cabinet, had to be adjusted. So this Perpu, this emergency law, allowed the government to extend the state budget deficit beyond the normal limit of 3% of GDP and to allocate extra spending to the COVID-19 response, while protecting officials from any legal charges as long as they acted in good faith and according to law. The government allocated extra amounts for healthcare, social protections, and tax incentives and credits for enterprises. The largest amount was set aside for economic recovery programs. And on 12 May 2020, Parliament approved the Perpu, this emergency law, and voted into law. However, an application was immediately lodged with the Constitutional Court to challenge the validity of Perpu. Up until now, the Indonesia Constitutional Court has not issued its decision yet. I guess it would be very unlikely that the court would declare the act invalid, but if it agreed with applicants it would partially undermine the government's effort. In 15 May 2020, Indonesia had recorded 16,496 cases. That's last year, the second highest total in Southeast Asia behind Singapore. In terms of numbers of deaths, last year, Indonesia ranked 5th in Asia with 1,076 people. But the current data now, May 2021, Indonesia has recorded 1.79 million COVID cases, a big jump from 16,000 last year to 1.79 million this year. Death, less than 50,000 people, 49,000 something, jump from 1,000 to 49. However, the number of deaths may be much higher than reported, as those who died without having been tested and confirmed to be positive of COVID were not counted in the official figures. Considering these undetected or under-detected cases, WHO Director sent an official letter on 15th of March 2020, followed by a direct phone call to President Jokowi, requesting that Indonesia scale up its emergency response and declare a national emergency. Responding to this pressure, Jokowi then declared a public health emergency on 31st of March and opted for this PSBB, or large-scale social restrictions. So moving to the next issue, since 1999, Indonesia has served as a model of Muslim democracy. One of the reasons for the success of this democratization is the state's generally positive position in relation to diversity. Indonesian state policy has never favored one of the many Islamic constituencies that make Indonesian Islam so diverse. This accommodation has led to high participation by Muslim groups in a vibrant democratic life. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed some problems with this model of inclusiveness. This emergency situation has required uniformity of messaging, broad support for difficult policy steps, and high levels of public trust. Islam in Indonesia is a crucial element of public communication, and it has emerged that this fragmentation of the religious community has not helped Indonesian responses to the pandemic. An example of its adaptation of ritual practice informs that prevent the spread of the virus. Authoritative interpretations that support these adaptations have presented believers with a dilemma. Either they choose to lock down their prayers at home, or they view the pandemic as a challenge to their faith and in response refuse to maintain a social distance from God and the public rituals that are part of their beliefs. This decision indicates a lack of trust in public messaging by concerned civil society groups and to a lesser extent by the government. In other words, COVID-19 is seen as a health issue as well as a test of faith. Indonesian Muslims have been forced to contemplate a fundamental question: what is the purpose or benefit of ritual and worship? Is it something performed only to serve God, no matter the situation? Or is its purpose of making you and your loved ones happy and safe? Those who believe that ritual is intended primarily to serve God will put public worship ahead of concerns over COVID-19. They challenge other believers with difficult questions. Why you are afraid of the virus? You should be afraid of God. They oppose government regulation, forbidding them to organize mass prayers in mosques. In contrast, other Muslims take a different position. God does not need our prayers. We are the ones who love God. We are the one who needs God. For this segment, there is room for interpretation and relaxation of some ritual requirements because worship is not solely for the benefit of God, but for us. This position is represented by the three most prominent Islamic civil society organizations in Indonesia: the Indonesian Council of Ulama, Majelis Ulama Indonesia or MUI, Nahdlatul Ulama, and Muhammadiyah. They have all issued religious rulings or fatwas ordering followers to some extent to avoid mass gatherings at the mosque. However, many mosques are still holding regular Friday prayers as well as daily prayers. And while Islamic authority is so fragmented, the question arises, which fatwa ought to be followed on such issues? A further diversity-related problem is the government's insecurity in the face of public criticism of its Islamic credentials. It seems that the Jokowi administration was reluctant to impose strict prohibitions for people gathering at places of worship during the pandemic. Prohibitions could trigger a political move by Islamist political parties. The situation seems to be getting worse when members of Jokowi's own administration issued different and conflicting statements and even confusing regulation, signaling to the already confused public a lack of coordination among key government officials. The Jokowi administration decided to take a balanced approach between health and the economy. Their initiative was named the New Normal, suggesting a middle way that would allow people to work and boost the economy. Large-scale social restrictions are being relaxed. However, despite the mantra of flattening the curve, this goal has not been reached. It's not a new normal, and potentially it is a new disaster. The government's reluctance to restrict economic activity has conflicted with the fatwas and guidance provided by the Islamic organizations. The dissonance between the government's policy and the fatwas of this group has invited people to ask, why does the government allow people to work in companies and factories, but at the same time discourage them to go to the mosque? Worship at the mosque lasts only 30-60 minutes, whereas workers remain at the office factory for 8-10 hours. The market remains open and does not facilitate a physical distancing. Why, Muslims ask, ought we practice physical distancing at a length of 1 meter from the next worshipper in the mosque? Public trust is the victim here. As a result, some Muslims believe that the government's policy places special restrictions on Muslim groups. They accused the Jokowi government of being anti-Islam. The low levels of trust emerge in conspiracy theories arguing that the COVID-19 pandemic is created by China or by Jews, the US, or Bill Gates. Some of them simply deny that COVID-19 is real. As a result of the new normal, people now gather in all kinds of spaces, including at mosques. The fatwa allowing people to pray at home appears to have lost effect. It is business as usual now. Only few mosques are still practicing physical distancing and health protocol. Despite this, civil society has produced its own initiative. People are working together to overcome the crisis. We see that many crowdfunding campaigns have been launched on local platforms to help those in need. This includes raising funds to support informal sector workers, such as street food sellers and motorcycle taxi drivers, Grab driver, and to purchase personal protective equipment for healthcare workers. Overall, the response from Jokowi administration was too little, too late. The Jokowi administration was pushed into a corner, making unclear policies, uncoordinated responses, and conflicting statements. It's still a long way to go for Indonesia to go to the new normal. Let's hope it will not be a new disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadir. And over to Simon Butt to give commentary.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Nadir, and it's a great honor to be invited to comment on your paper. You're a scholar whose work I very much respect and admire, and I'm glad that Victor asked Nadir to write the chapter. Also, on behalf of CAPLIS, Luke and Jeanne, who are here now too, and also University of Sydney Law School, it's just fantastic to be able to work together with Victor, with Helen, with the others of the centre to hold this event and celebrate this wonderful book. Now, Nadir, I think, has painted a fairly bleak picture of the Indonesian government's response, particularly the Jokowi central government administration response to the COVID outbreak. I suppose it's quite important to underline, though, that problems of governance, problems of politicking, and religion-related complications are certainly not new problems for Indonesia or impediments for Indonesia in any area of policy, I suppose. But the pandemic really has brought them into sharp relief. And I think it's also important to note the massive challenge that Indonesia would present to any government, no matter how professionally arranged, no matter how efficient and responsive. It's a massive country, 250 million people. spread across 5,000 kilometres of islands. It's pretty difficult to exert control over every corner of Indonesia. And of course, with a pandemic like this, your weakest link can bring down even the best of intentions. So, I just wanted to emphasize, it all does seem to be relatively doom and gloom, but and it is. I mean, Nadir mentioned the statistics, but it's a very difficult situation in Indonesia for the Jokowi administration. Even you accept the problems. The country doesn't present any easy paths forward. Now, I note that, of course, when Nadir and Nadirsyah wrote the chapter, a vaccine had not become available. And as one might expect, now that we have a few of them in circulation around the world, the pandemic-related focus of the Indonesian government has now, in part at least, been to obtain a sufficient quantity, I should say, of these vaccines, and to obtain vaccines that are reasonably reputable, at least for the Indonesian market. Now, Indonesia's been able to get a bit of AstraZeneca and a couple of Chinese vaccines, Sinovac and Sinopharm, as far as I can tell, but it hasn't been able to obtain anywhere near enough doses to vaccinate even a decent proportion of its population. Earlier this month, I think about 9 million Indonesians had their first dose, and received both doses, I should say, and about 14 million had received the first dose. So a relatively small percentage of the population. But it still has this target of reaching about 180 million people within the next year or so. Some objective commentators say it's very likely to take much longer than this, perhaps even up to 2023. In terms of the vaccine rollout, convincing members of the public to go and be vaccinated, and drawing on Victor's theme about how the themes in these chapters have continued to play out, I think we can see again politics, ineptitude, and religion playing a significant part. Again, since Nadir's paper was written, various government officials have come forward with things that they think the public should be doing to ward off the virus, hence making it unnecessary to be vaccinated or to worry about social distancing, etc. Ministry of Agriculture promoted an aromatherapy necklace with eucalyptus leaves, and suggested that 15 minutes of wearing this could kill 42% of the virus, and 30 minutes would kill 80% of the virus. To put a comedy Australian spin on it, it's no surprise that koalas haven't been hit with coronavirus so far, given that their diet is all of eucalyptus leaves. A West Aceh regent referred to his home remedy. He had contracted COVID and said that he lived on coconut water, honey, and lemon, and he kind of overcame the virus. There are lots of examples of these types of remedies that various people have put forward, which I could mention, but I won't due to time. I want to just focus a little bit on the role of religion, and I'm a bit reluctant to talk about this because Nadir is one of the leading authorities on the role of religion in and the law in Indonesia, in particular fatwa that are issued by various Islamic institutions, but I'm going to attempt it anyway. One of the problems that the vaccine rollout and indeed slowing the spread in Indonesia has encountered is this idea of mudik, or returning from a big city to one's original village after Ramadan, after the month of Ramadan, in order to meet with family and celebrate. And a constant theme, Nadir mentioned this in his chapter, and it's happened again this current year, has been trying to prevent people from taking the virus with them. And one of the main problems has been trying to prevent people from leaving the city. There have been blockades this year, but again, lots of mixed messages from the government about what people should or shouldn't do, whether they are permitted to go back to the villages or not. It's a really serious issue. After Idul-Fitri last year, after this, after the end of the fasting month last year, and everyone leaving to go, and everyone in the cities leaving to go and visit their villages, there was a spike of about 80%. It's quite common after holidays, Independence Day, I think New Year's Day too, there were spikes of 60 and 50% respectively. The final issue I'll mention here is the idea that some have put forward that the vaccines might not be halal, might be haram according to Islamic law, and they contain pork products. And there have been some influential Islamic figures, including the Vice President, who said, well, this is an emergency situation. It doesn't matter if it's got pork in it. You know, there's an excuse for consuming haram items such as this during emergencies. But there are still some people who are apparently avoiding vaccination or expected to avoid vaccination for this reason. Again, something that could be overcome by consistent government messaging, but hasn't as yet. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Simon. Now we're staying in the region of Southeast Asia and going to Malaysia, and I invite Amzil Tayeb to give us a talk about Chapter 22, Malaysia Improvised Pandemic Policies and Democratic Regression.
Thank you a lot, Helen. Good morning, everyone. Our chapter was written during the first wave of the pandemic last year. And two main aspects of the chapter are still relevant until today. One is the improvised pandemic policies and the democratic regression. And it's still the two persistent themes that we can still observe until today. But I'll start with the first wave of the pandemic. So what took place in Malaysia in late February last year was an abrupt change of government. So the former ruling coalition that took power in 2018 in an unprecedented change of government, because as those who follow Malaysian politics know that for 60 years, Malaysia had been ruled by the same coalition. So in 2018, there was this unprecedented change of government, which only lasted for 22 months. And then there was an abrupt change of power, the defections, and then a new coalition was established, formed in late 2008 to 2020, which was quite an unfortunate time to launch a coup, so to speak. Because I didn't think they were expecting that there's a global pandemic on the horizon when they decided to, this cabal of people who decided to launch the coup. So that's what happened. I think it's important to frame the discussion, or at least the response, the pandemic response in Malaysia in this context. On 1st of March 2020, a new prime minister was sworn in, and he immediately had to face this, the threat of the pandemic, the global pandemic. In the middle of March, the government announced a partial lockdown. So it wasn't a total lockdown like we saw in other countries, especially in China, in Wuhan. But it's partial lockdown, but it's still quite severe. Police blockades everywhere. and it's called the Movement Control Order, MCO. So, and that lasted for about 3 months or so, and to a large extent, it was quite successful. It managed to control the number of cases in Malaysia, and but of course at a heavy economic cost. So the the economy shrunk. I think it was about 18% at this time. But by late July, the number of cases was actually brought down to a single. No, it's actually one case. I think I remember in late July, there's only one positive case in Malaysia. So it was largely successful until the struggle for power. But like I say, the struggle for power still continue at this time. The same coalition that took control of the federal government now attempted to take control of state governments in Malaysia. So they've been successful at the federal level. Now they're trying to take control at the state level. So some of the states in Malaysia where the majority coalition, is quite slim, which actually provided an opportunity for defections, to flip the control of the state government, and that what actually happened. So the defining moment was what happened in the state government in Sabah, which is in the Malaysian Borneo, which actually triggered a by-election, because of the government were broke up because of defections, and then that triggered a by-election, and that was a turning point, and people were coming from the peninsula to campaign in Malaysian Borneo, in Sabah, and you can see suddenly there's a spike in number of cases there, and there was an outbreak of the number of cases in Sabah. And those who went to Sabah to campaign, when they returned back to the Peninsula Malaysia, to West Malaysia, they were not required to quarantine themselves, and that was a huge mistake. Even though there were outbreak of cases in Sabah, but when they came back, they can just resume, normal life without having to even self-quarantine. So immediately we see spike of cases in West Malaysia, in the Peninsula Malaysia, from one case in late July, and it rose up astronomically, to few hundred cases, and by early this year in January, it was already more than 1,000 cases. So, but the themes still persisted, right? So because this government came to power with no coherent agenda, and not even a coherent coalition, because it is a coalition that's built on defections. So there is no ideological coherency, for example. So it's just like some people getting together and decided to topple the government, But and this actually reflected in the responses, the government responses, towards the pandemic, because you have there are so many cases in Malaysia where you have ministers from different political parties, would announce contradicting policies, and contradict each other, which is it's comical, if not tragic, right? Because we would have been comical in normal times, but we're living in pandemic time, so it's actually quite tragic, when the ministers of the government is not able to get his act together. So you have the Minister of Health maybe announcing, some policy or new policy in the morning, and then by the afternoon, the Minister of, let's say, Interior Affairs, somebody would announce something else, that contradict, the minister. So that's been the story, for the past year. So what happens is because this government came to power undemocratically, right? So it wasn't through election. So it has been trying to avoid a vote of no confidence in the parliament for the past year. And it's been using the pandemic as an excuse, to not have the parliament, to convene the parliament, and then for fear of there's a vote of no confidence, right? So what they tried to do in October last year was to call for a state of emergency to combat the pandemic, which was ridiculous at the time because there were only a few hundred cases. So, but they did manage to get the state of emergency by January this year, because the cases went up to more than 1,000 at the time. And now, to put in perspective, the latest number of cases in Malaysia is almost 8,000 by yesterday. So from one case in late July, and now we're towards the end of May, it was almost 8,000 cases. So it has taken a turn for worse. So now Malaysia is still in the state of emergency, which is not a typical state of emergency because there's no military presence, in public and things like that. Only what the government call as political emergency, because the parliament is still not allowed to convene. So there's no parliament in Malaysia, parliament sitting in Malaysia for more than a year now. And no, for almost a year. So in a way, this is, there's no accountability when it comes to this government. There's no transparency. There's no way to question the policies of the government. So you have the opposition taking it to the media, actually, to question government's policies because the parliament is closed for business. So that is exactly what's happening in Malaysia right now. Even the vaccine rollout, is plagued with so many issues. It's very slow, very inefficient, and there's no way of, and there's also corruption, of course, but there's no way of questioning that because the parliament is closed. So that's the story of Malaysia for the past year in fighting the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amzil. Over to you, Luke, for a very short commentary.
No, I'd like to invite Professor Matsui to talk in 10 minutes on Japan first, and then that will leave 5 minutes for me to comment on both, if you don't mind.
That would be great. Okay, over to you, Professor Matsui.
Thank you. Can you hear me, everybody? Yes. So I wrote a chapter on Japan together with my colleague in Kyushu, Professor Ono, and we outlined the basic response to the Japanese government against the COVID-19. So everybody knows that the COVID-19's outbreak in January the 2019, and all the countries in the world came to realize potential risk in following January 2020. But most of the countries are very slow to respond. That includes Japan as well. Japan initially introduced a very mild immigration and border control, and then beef up the infectious disease preparation protocols. But I suppose that Japan has not introduced a tight border control like Australia's, and also Taiwan's, and also the preparation was not sufficient. So with a gradual increase of the infected patient, the Japanese government was forced to scramble. And although Japanese have a very elaborate legal system in light of the infectious disease pandemic, but the problem of this infectious disease legal system in Japan is that it is so fragmented and it is so restrictive. So there is no emergency powers, so there is no broad, flexible governmental powers. So everything is stipulated and everything needs to be limited to the minimum. So this is one of the very basic difficulties of the infectious disease control system of Japan. And eventually the Japanese government realized the defect, and came to revise a statute to allow the government to declare medical emergency and adopt somewhat much more stronger powers. And eventually the government was forced to declare medical emergencies and then introduce various kind of countermeasures against COVID-19. But still, declaration of emergencies and the various kind of countermeasures introduced by the Japanese government are very soft and mild. All they can do is to simply ask everybody to stay home or refrain from going out. And eventually the government has still intensified the governmental power. And now the government is allowed to impose some kind of a sanction against the business operators who doesn't follow the governmental orders. But still, they don't have any power to enforce this kind of orders against the general public. So still, many of the public are not legally restrained or mandated to stay home or refrain from social gathering. So to that extent, the Japanese approach is very much mild and soft. And but still, I guess the Japanese government fundamental approach or principle of this COVID-19 response was that they needed to maintain the medical system. They well know that the collapse of the medical system, especially the doctors and hospitals in Italy and other parts of the European countries. So Japanese government wanted to prevent total collapse of the medical system. So that is the reason why the Japanese government initially limited PCR testing to very serious patients, and the Japanese government focused on providing a treatment against a very serious patient, not everybody. So this is one of the approach adopted by the Japanese government. Many Japanese people are unhappy, and strong criticisms usually expressed by the mass media commentators and the leading mass medias. But I suppose the Japanese government has been somewhat successful because that in light of the number of the infected patient as well as total death, the policy of keeping the death toll to the minimum seems to be working to some extent. And this is pretty much the conclusion we wrote in our chapters. What had happened after we finished our chapters? Well, Japanese government was successful in containing spread of the COVID-19 for summers. And it looks like the Japanese government was pretty much can survive. But now the gradual increase of the much more serious, much more infectious variant, and also a significant increase of the infected patient, Japanese medical system as well as the government is facing another crisis. So looks like many of the Japanese publics are pretty much unhappy with the governmental responses and slowness of its response. Well, now the Japanese government is facing the prospect of welcoming the Tokyo Olympic in July. It's not far away. And many of the people are pretty much afraid of the another spread of the COVID-19. Well, one of the problem is that because Japanese government was somewhat successful in containing the infections, well, the Japanese government was very slow to secure the vaccination. So even after the Japanese government has secured, I suppose, sufficient number of the dosages, they're not coming first. So I guess right now, the vaccination rate among the total population is less than 4%. Although in Canada, in the United States and the United UK, the more than the 50% of the public are now vaccinated at least once. But this is far cry from the total vaccination stages. And it will take probably more than 1 year to finish up the vaccination. So this is one of the worries that the Japanese government is now facing. So I'm gonna share my screen, I hope. This is the chart prepared by the Japanese government. So this is a pictures chart of the infected patient as well as total death. As of May 27th, about 729,000 infected patients were found and confirmed. This is the number of the patients who are confirmed by the testing. And this is the total deaths of the pandemic. It's about 12,900 deaths. So this is still far better, I guess. But this is the current pictures of the world international comparison. So right now, the number of the confirmed deaths per million people in Japan is 0.92. And this is pretty much compared to 0.9 in Canada. And it's still far better than the United States, where it counts 3.05 confirmed deaths per millions. But it is still significantly not better because South Korea is 0.06 and Australia is almost 0. So this is if you look down the much better statistics, still Japan's situation is pretty difficult, but it is still very much better than the other countries in other parts. So this is a cumulative number of confirmed deaths. So if you can see this whole pictures, you can see the Australia is better and Japan is pretty much better, and Canada is still better than most of the European countries, even especially from the United Kingdom. And India and the United States are far more worse than Japan with respect to cumulative death. So to some extent, still, I guess the Japanese policy of keeping the maximum number of the total death toll to minimum seems to be working. But who knows, if it takes too long to finish up the vaccination, Japanese situation might become much more serious. And one of the hardest obstacle of the vaccination rollout in Japan is a very significant vaccination hesitancies among the Japanese public. So Japanese public have a very strong hesitancies against the vaccination. So this is one of the very strongest worries among the Japanese people. And probably this will be the significant hurdle, the biggest hurdle the Japanese government must overcome in surviving in this COVID-19 pandemics. So this is the situation in Japan. It is mildly somewhat successful, but the future is still unknown. So we must wait and see how Japan could be managed to succeed in containing and surviving this COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you. Luke, over to you.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, so I'll have to be brief, but I thought I would try to make a few comments comparing first Malaysia and Japan. Thank you for the both very interesting chapters and now presentations with updates. So in Japan, we're talking about a country with 4 times the population, a lot more elderly people, and of course a developed country rather than a middle income country as in Malaysia. But also we have in Japan initially quite similarly some very stable politics until Malaysia recently had a big change of government. The other difference has been that within the conservative ruling party domination of Japanese politics for most of the post-war period, although the prime ministers often changed during the period of the pandemic, in fact for 8 years, Prime Minister Abe was led a very sort of stable administration as Prime Minister. And so, you know, that was a big difference from Malaysia, which had been through a lot of political turmoil just as the pandemic hit last year. If we look at some of the differences in outcomes, as Professor Matsui has shown actually nicely with some of that data, but if we just compare Japan and Malaysia, there have been per capita fewer infections and comparable deaths, which could be explained by Japan's more elderly population. But the biggest difference is that Japan has achieved these outcomes without sort of hard lockdowns. Even now, as Professor Matsui has mentioned, with revisions to these emergency powers legislation, which of course is in the shadow of the post-war constitution and the earlier militarist government, and that led Japan into the Second World War, the revisions only allow sanctions against businesses, but don't allow sort of the police to fine or arrest people who are violating, travel or movement restrictions, like in Malaysia or Australia for that matter. And so in terms of balancing, if you like, trying to get a public health crisis under control and while maintaining some civil liberties and some economic activity, Japan seemed to have a pretty good balance, despite lots of tragic deaths, particularly amongst the elderly, which happen in large numbers for other causes every year as well. So, but the difference now between the two countries is that although Japan has introduced an extended state of emergency measures, and this is already seeing a downturn in infections and deaths, which only ever peaked at about 100 a day, but that would seem to be a trigger to introduce the more stringent measures. Malaysia is still going up, Japan is coming down, and that's because of these Olympics coming up. And as you say, that's a big concern, Professor Matsui, because of the slow vaccination rollout. Now, but I'm interested, if we've got a minute, maybe come back to you and ask you a bit more about why you think Japanese have this some hesitancy about taking the vaccinations. I mean, many countries are experiencing this, particularly in countries that have low levels of infections and deaths and so on, and therefore are individuals are maybe trying to weigh up the cost benefits and so on, unlike, say, the US or the UK or Europe, where there's much higher deaths and a clear need, to protect oneself and one's loved ones and so on. But it seems a bit counterintuitive, because Japan was able to succeed remarkably last year in getting people to stay at home and businesses to restrict their hours without hard law, without hard sanctions, relying on sort of basic, essentially, authority without power, to use the famous book title of Professor John Haley about Japanese law, and really social norms and social capital. And like other sort of relatively homogenous populations, Japan has a high level of what they call political scientists refer to as bonding social capital. But it also has a lot of bridging social capital between, so for example, religious organizations or and so on, between dissimilar subgroups within society. And this is really important in disaster management research. Simon and I edited a book about Asia-Pacific disaster management after Japan's 2011 disasters and other big disasters in the Asia-Pacific region. And it explains why, the country can get together even without hard law, last year at least in Japan, to achieve some pretty impressive outcomes. And it's sort of unusual. It's striking that somehow, at least until now, the Japanese population and this high level of social capital and trust that results from it hasn't led to more vaccination uptake and this hesitancy you mentioned, which I think is going to be the key thing, not just in Japan but in many other countries now. And in Australia, we've got a tiny breakout in Melbourne now, and all of a sudden the vaccination rates have gone up. There's plenty of supply, but people were maybe acting a bit similar to Japan and being a bit cautious about taking the variety of vaccines that are available, actually, thankfully, in Australia. But maybe we can just end by coming back to you, Professor Matsui, about that point you made, which is very intriguing and probably very relevant to other countries, and indeed the whole world, as we enter into this new phase of trying to get everyone vaccinated.
Helen, do we have some time to answer?
Not really.
Not really. Okay.
But maybe a couple of minutes.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Sorry.
It's okay. I suppose partly because of the mass media's report, and especially the minor journalist and mass media and the social media report. So every time there was some kind of a casualties after vaccination take, the mass media reported that somebody died. without repeating any connections or casual relationship. Well, everybody knows that somebody gonna die after vaccination, so it's not worth reporting. But because of many mass medias report this kind of casualties, and many people came to fear that the eventual the casualties. So that is probably a reason for many of the Japanese people to accept the vaccination. And I guess this is one of the how to motivate the Japanese public to get vaccinated is the most challenging task.
Well, maybe the upcoming Olympics will change, or, you know, will
I hope
change
so.
things, and you know,
I hope so. Yeah.
But it is a risk, and yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully it can be well managed, and Japan can come together again, and you know, show us how it's done.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have run out of time.
Okay.
So my apologies to the audience, who I'm sure had many questions to ask. And it's our loss, because it would have been wonderful to have another hour and a half to continue this discussion. It's been a terrific event. Thank you to all of you, presenters, discussants, for giving us such amazing insights, and to bring us up to date on your respective countries that were the focus of your chapters. So well done. And many thanks on behalf of both CAPLIS, if I may, and CAPI.